Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us in our presentation today titled Digital Design and Children's Creative Thinking, Pedagogy Counts Too. I would like to firstly acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we are meeting on today, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Just really briefly, our research team is a member of the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child. I'm just going to take a moment and put our slides up onto the screen. So bear with me while I move between screens. Okay, so the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child has a vision where Australian children will be healthy, educated and connected in a digital world. So our team is quite large. There are in fact 13 researchers as a part of our core team. But in the presentation today, I'm leading the presentation with Associate Professor Susan Blackleaf, who couldn't be here with us today. She's also an Associate Investigator in the Centre. But I have here with me Emma Cross and Katie Fielding. So can I hand over to each of you to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, so I'm Emma Cross here. I'm a researcher with the Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child. My core project and main focus at the moment sits with the Creative Cove project, which I'm going to tell you a little bit more about shortly.
Hi, I'm Katie Fielding. I'm also a researcher with the Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child, and my research focuses on the way that creativity is developed and understood in young children, with a particular focus on digital technologies.
Thank you, and thank you for those introductions. We are in a COVID-affected area, but I'm going to take masks off and we're socially distancing at this point for the remainder of the presentation. So I've put up the slide here, which introduces the perspective and positioning of our research team and our core project, which is children's creativity and connectedness with digital technologies. So there are some underlying assumptions and assertions about the work we're doing. We are aiming to investigate safe, productive, and creative uses of digital technology by young children. So we are aiming as a research collective, who we refer to ourselves as the Creativity Collective, we are aiming to provide empirical research evidence that will support educators and parents as they are engaging with young children during digital play experiences. This presentation today, we're really unpacking and exploring the digital design features of a range of devices that are used by young children as they're being creative problem solvers and learning to code. We're exploring what type of technologies, when and how to effectively integrate these devices into children's learning environments. So some of the background literature that we've used to frame our work, really we're looking at the idea of how much time. Yes, it's important to know that, but probably more important, not just how much time children spend with digital devices, but understanding what it is that they're doing and how this is impacting on their thinking and their cognitive development. So we're really focused on thinking about how children are actively engaged during the time they spend with a digital device. And in thinking through how they engage, we're considering what is effective and appropriate use. So we are thinking well beyond simply the amount of time children have with devices, but the quality of the time that they are engaged. We see and have drawn from the literature examples of how quality experiences with digital technologies actually empower children as creative controllers with digital devices rather than passive consumers of technology. And we've also seen how, and from the literature of course, that with adaptive scaffolding and quality pedagogy, educators can enhance the experience of the child with a digital technology. So we see that it's a twofold here. Yes, it is the design features of the digital devices, but we are also exploring how pedagogy impacts, and hence the title of our presentation today, pedagogy counts too. I'd like to now hand over to Emma Cross, and she's going to be talking to us about the place of digital technologies in the Australian Early Years Learning Framework. So I hand over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Karen. So yeah, a little bit of a background. In Australia, we do have a range of governing frameworks and documents that really guide and underpin everything that we do. The Early Years Learning Framework is one of the key and primary frameworks in that space that really underpins our educational programs and practices. So within that, there is actually explicit expectation that educators are integrating digital technologies into learning environments, which really emphasises and highlights the importance of educators being confident with these devices and also capable to implement meaningful pedagogy. Now, across the EYLF, we do actually see mention to digital technologies in a few different places. They talk about it generally in the learning environment, as well as outcome 4 and outcome 5 more explicitly. Now, when we're looking at digital coding devices, it's really important that educators actually know and are confident with the different devices that really support and enhance children's creative skills and creative thinking. So there are a range of different devices that can do that, and we've selected certain devices based on their ability to provoke young children's creative thinking. We also chose these devices because they would be able to be integrated into the learning environment and really complement existing resources rather than being something completely separate. This is actually an ongoing project that we have, which is the Creative Cove. With that project, we are working in partnership with SciTech, who is the Science Exploration Centre in Perth, Western Australia. So through this project, we are facilitating a range of digital play experiences, and there are really two core facilitators through those experiences, parents being a key facilitator as well as educators. We've chosen a range of devices, like I said, but we are currently focusing on 4 devices. So we're looking at the Bebot, Cubeto, the Bebot coding app, and the Botsy coding device, which also has an augmented reality iPad app. The Creative Cove draws on our existing work from an action research project, which we worked in partnership with practitioner researchers. And I was in fact fortunate enough to be a practitioner research in that project. With this project, we had 3 primary devices that we were using. We used the Bebots, Cubeto, and the Bebot iPad app, which was really interesting for us because we were able to see the different ways these devices could be used and the different outcomes for young children and their learning and creativity. So as you can see here in these images, this was actually an opportunity where we had a design-based experience. So the children developed different ramps and different structures and tried to move the bee along those. Through these experiences, the children were also able to develop their storytelling skills. So with the Bebot in particular, there's no visual representation of the code or the input that the children are putting into the device. So they really had difficulty remembering the sequence of code that actually entered into the bee. This promoted us as educators to encourage them to write down what they had coded to help them with that memory and recall. But as an outcome, the children were eventually able to not only write these sequences of code, but they were actually able to read code and take somebody else's written code and put that into the bee as well. So these were pre-formal literacy age children that were able to read and write this code. Now, Cubeto is a little bit different because there is a tangible coding interface and the children can see and represent their code with the programming chips. This was really supportive of their, obviously, visualization, but it also really helped them to problem solve and debug any problems that occurred in their coding sequences. Looking at the iPads, this was a completely different software in itself, and it came with its own set of complexities too. So despite the children's competence and confidence working with these more tangible devices, they had a little bit of difficulty transferring these skills from the tangible devices across to the iPad. We saw this particularly with the children's ability to understand direction and orientation. So this really emphasised the need for us as educators to develop really clear pedagogy and scaffold that learning appropriately. So the first thing that we did was actually take the coding and we took it unplugged. So we put all of the devices away and the children sat down and we went through it a little bit more explicitly with them. The first strategy that we used was putting stickers on the children's hands. So on their right hand, they had a red sticker and on their left hand, they had a yellow sticker. The colour of these stickers actually correspond with the Cubeto coding chips. But as we went through, we kept, emphasising red and right so that the children could remember which one was right and which was left. We then played a range of follow the leader games, so encouraging the children to follow basic instructions using directional language. So things like turn one step to the right or, take one step forward. And these were just the sorts of activities that we use to really support the children to develop those directional understandings. From there, we went back to the iPads and really tried to apply that understanding back on the iPads. So there are a few other things that we used here as well to support the children with those directions, because it was still a bit of a struggle for them. So the first thing that we encouraged them to do was actually turn the iPad so they could see from the point of view of the bee and hence see which way was going to be right and which way was left, as that did move as the bee moved. We also gave them the actual bee bot so that they could move that alongside the bee that was moving through the game. And we gave them directional cards as well, so they could also move that and see which way was right and which way was left. And these are all the sorts of pedagogical approaches that we use to support the children to transfer their knowledge from a tangible sense to these iPad apps, which were a little bit more complex. I'm going to hand over to Katie now. These have been examples of digital technologies in an early years learning centre, but I'm going to hand to Katie to tell us a little bit more about BOTC in a home environment.
Thanks, Emma. So as Emma said, the experiences that have been discussed so far have happened in sort of formal learning environments in an early learning centre. And the example of using BOTC happened in the home. So I just want to make it really explicit that why that's important is because when we talk about, the education of young children, we're talking about all of that sort of educational experience they have, not just the formal trained educators who are incredibly important, of course, but also parents and family members as first educators. So you can see in that first image in the bottom left of the screen there that this experience was with 3 children of differing ages. So there was a 10-year-old, a 4.5-year-old and a 2-year-old. And in many ways, the 10-year-old became the educator. She was the one who learned about the BOTC robot and the app that controlled it. And she was the one who was providing a lot of these educational experiences for the younger children. So I just really want to emphasize how important all educators are, whether that's the formal education or it's those, parents, family members, and so on that happen in the home as well. We're looking at how each of these devices really have a focus on creativity and, giving children opportunities to display and develop their creativity. And so I just wanted to touch on a couple of things that were sort of hindrances as well as supports in terms of the BOTC, which was a bit different to the other devices in that it had an augmented reality component. The children thought that was amazing, mostly because of the way that it integrated their physical environment with the digital environment. And you can see perhaps on those screens there, the way that BOTC is being controlled through the app, but is also a physical presence in their environment as well. And that was really important in drawing in aspects of their environment, not just being a digital sort of experience here. So in that middle picture, you'll see the 4.5-year-old using Lego blocks. And that was really engaging for the children, because it meant that they were able to take aspects of their environment that they're very used to, very familiar with, and bring them into this new experience, both to enhance the experience, but also to provide challenge. So in that middle example there, the child basically set themselves a challenge of how can I get this robot to go through an arch. Now, that seems like a pretty simple kind of problem to solve, but it really was quite complex. There was thoughts about how big to make the arch, what to make it out of, how to make it strong enough so that when Botsy hit it, inevitably it didn't collapse. It required sort of fine motor skills in terms of how can I control Botsy, how can I make it move where I want to go. And it required a lot of perseverance on this 4.5-year-old's part to be able to get through that challenge to come out with a solution at the end. And as I said earlier, in terms of who the educator was in this case, it was actually the older child who was able to jump in and give suggestions and help fix up the arch when it was broken, and to provide stimulation and suggestion without actually taking over and doing that for the other child. You'll also see in that third picture there that we have a 2-year-old, very rudimentary, the way that they were able to engage. But because of that sort of connection between the physical and the digital, it really did give that child an opportunity to start having a sense of, well, this device controls that device. And you know, I think that that was quite important in being able to bridge that divide between the physical and the digital. But all of that was happening largely with the sort of remote controlled aspect, I guess you could call it, the mode of operation of Botsy that was moving it without code. There's also a coding mode that can be used to control the robot as well. Now, that was really quite a big shift in their ability, their what they needed to be able to do to control that particular device. And part of the issues was things like Emma mentioned about needing to understand right and left and how to orient themselves in the space. But being the physical device working with a digital device meant that the children could move themselves to orient themselves in that space to get a better sense of how do I want the robot to move. One of the, I guess, hindrances to the children's ability to be using these devices creatively and experimenting with them in particular was that the coding mode, once you pressed play on the code that was input, that code then disappeared. So it really limited their ability to tinker with the code to try to debug their program to get the robot to do what they wanted it to do. And hence the importance of the educator, the parent, the older child, whoever it might be, in helping them to either remember that code or to give them ideas about how we could use paper or other, whiteboard and so on to write down that code in order to be able to remember it and debug it. So in terms of the device, lots of really great things about it, but also some issues where the educator became really important. So we've been looking at all of these devices through a framework of creativity in early childhood. We're really not looking at these devices just in terms of how do they engage children or why are they fun, but how can they help to develop and demonstrate children's creativity. So one of the issues that we have when it comes to creativity is that we often all have this sense of what creativity kind of is and what it means, but we often look at the product in order to decide whether something is creative. But when we look at really defining for ourselves what is creativity, Mel Rhodes's work in the 4 Ps of creativity has been really important to us as a group to, I guess, sort of conceptualize and operationalize what creativity really is with young children. So Rhodes suggested that creativity really occurs at the intersection of the product, the person, the place, and the process. What it is that makes something creative, who is doing the thinking, what aspects of the environment enable that creativity to take place, and also importantly for us, what are the characteristics of creative thinking? How does creative thinking become a behavior? What is it that we see that demonstrates creative thinking is happening? So to really briefly have a look at the first 3 Ps of the four Ps, when we are looking at a product that is creative, there's a lot of discussion about creativity and what it is and how we define it. But really, one of the things that we do kind of agree on is that for something to be creative, it has to be original and it needs to be fit for purpose. And it's really key that with young children, when we think of originality, we're thinking about it being original to them. The kind of products, the kind of ideas that young children are likely to have are not necessarily going to be, amazingly creative from an adult's perspective. But when we really stand in their shoes and think about, well, what is this thing that I've come up with? If it's original to them, that's the point. We think about the person. Who is it that is doing the creative thinking? And again, this is really important when we're looking at digital devices that can facilitate creativity, because what we don't want is are devices that do all the creative thinking for them. And often digital devices and technologies can be so well designed that actually they take the creativity away from the child. The creativity has happened in the designing of the technology or the app or whatever it might be, but the child isn't the one who really has to think creatively. So we're looking for devices and technologies that really enhance the ability for the child to be the creative thinker here, with their parent or their educator as facilitating that creative thinking. We also look at the environment, the place. I guess we're looking in quite particularly at those resources, the stimulating materials, the provocations, having adequate materials and so on. But of course, part of the environment is that social emotional climate as well, how parents, educators and so on create an environment where we can be able to make mistakes without feeling worried about that, where there's not stress to get it right. And I guess part of the BOTSI, the Cubetto and the BBOT is that we are creating an environment where we have these, I guess in some ways, toys, that it is non-prescriptive because we're playing here, that it shouldn't be stressful and so on. So I think part of what these particular devices do is help to make that environment engaging. So we've talked about the 3 Ps of the product, the person and the place. And then we've got the 4th P of process. And this is where we see those creative thinking turning into creative behaviours. So you can see lots of examples here that connect into that A to E, those headings there. And these are the kinds of things that we see happening when young children are being creative. We see them imagining, we see them sharing, we see them investigating and tinkering and so on. And this particular framework emerged out of research that was being done using digital devices in early learning centres. So it was validated through actual research and seeing these things happening in real life. So what I was interested in is where the research sits in terms of the intersection between digital technologies and creativity with young children. And to get a sense of that, we engaged in a systematic literature review to see what was out there over the last 10 years or so. And really what we found is there's not very much. There hasn't been a lot of research that has really interrogated how we see technologies facilitating creative thinking and creative behaviour with young children. But what we did find that overall with what has been found so far is that what's really important is that technologies that are used with young children is well designed, and really importantly, that it's supported by good pedagogy. And I'll come back to that point I made right at the beginning, that when we talk about this supportive support of good pedagogy, that's not just in sort of formal education, but also it's the importance of parents and families as first educators as well. And so the work that is being done in the Creative Cove is really work with play with young children, and we work with their educators and their families and their parents all together to really draw out these creative thinking and creative behaviours that we see in young children. So I'm going to hand back to Karen now, who's going to pull it all together and sort of pose some questions for reflection.
So thank you so much to Katie and to Emma for the work they've done in sharing their experiences and their just really terrific high quality research that each of these people have been doing. So thank you to both of you for sharing that work today. As with any good research, I think that we are at a place where we are creating probably as many questions as we are finding solutions through the work that we're doing. So this ongoing program of research work. So I'd like to encourage you to join with us and reflect on some of these questions that are emerging for us as we grapple with understanding this context of children's creativity and connectedness with digital technologies. So we've shared what we found out so far, and we would like you to contribute to the discussion through the conference platform in relation to these three core questions. So what features of these digital devices do you see as being supportive of children's creative digital play? And what design features are potentially hindering children's creative thinking during digital play-based learning? And then in turn, how could educators and parents utilise some of the insights that we've gained to facilitate and to scaffold children's active and creative play-based learning with digital devices? So thank you very much for joining with us, and I look forward to engaging with you as we create some discourse and collegiality around these questions on the discussion platform. Thank you very much for joining us.